Morning, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Julia McCarthy. I'm a senior program officer with the New York Health Foundation. And before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. We'll be recording this webinar, and a recap with the link to the recording and other materials will be circulated afterwards. Video and audio are disabled for attendees, but we invite you to use the chat box throughout to share questions. And finally, we have closed captioning available for those of you who'd like to use that feature. You can click to find it in the top right corner. So today I'm honored to be joined by two guests from Met Council who will help us better understand the food access barriers for kosher and halal observant communities across New York State, as well as potential programmatic and policy actions that can reduce these barriers. So first, we have David Greenfield, Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of Met Council. As CEO and Executive Director, David has expanded Met Council's mission and services to help over 305,000 New Yorkers in need of direct services and policy advocacy. Prior to joining Met Council, David served on the New York City Council, where he authored nearly 30 pieces of legislation, including laws mandating affordable housing and reforming the landmarks preservation process. And he was also previously the Executive Vice President of the Sephardic Community Federation. And just to give you a sense of David's influence as both a civic and nonprofit leader, he was recently included in the Power 100's list of most powerful New Yorkers and most influential nonprofit leaders. He is a graduate of the Georgetown University Law Center and Thoreau College, where he was the valedictorian. And in all of his spare time, David also teaches as a law professor at Brooklyn Law School. So thank you, David, for joining us. We also have Jessica Chait, who's the Managing Director of the Food Programs and Policy for Met Council. Jessica has held this role since 2018, bringing greater visibility to food insecurity within the Jewish community and overseeing the incredible growth of their programming. So during this time, the food program has dramatically scaled its operations, and it is actually now the largest free kosher food distribution program in the world, serving over 200,000 clients each month. Under her leadership, Met Council has piloted and successfully scaled a program for nascent pantries serving halal requiring New Yorkers, an online ordering system, a mobile pantry, and a home delivery program. Prior to joining Met Council, Jessica worked for UJA Federation of New York in various roles, including Chief of Staff and for nonprofits in Poland and Zambia. And she holds a degree in psychology from the University of Texas and a master's degree in public administration from New York. That's a lot. So we're very excited to have them. David, I'll start with you. For those of us based in New York City, we're familiar with the work Met Council does, but there's a lot of people on this webinar who actually aren't from New York City. So can you start by giving us a little background on your organization? What's your mission? Who do you serve? What's the scope of your programming?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting this. And thanks to the New York Health Foundation. And welcome to everyone who is beyond the confines of New York. It's great to have everybody here. So Met Council was founded 50 years ago, really as an umbrella organization to address poverty within the Jewish community in the greater New York area. We've since grown in the last 50 years. And I think the important part of what we do is that while we're founded on Jewish values, we're not a religious organization. And we serve everyone regardless of their background. We actually just calculated this last week. Our staff speak 15 different languages to accommodate the variety of individuals that come through our doors, over 325,000 each year. We have 10 different departments that are really focused on fighting poverty. And one of the largest and most important departments that we have is our food department, where we really use that as a key to providing self-sufficiency for hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. And we try to do that through wraparound services that we provide as well. But what makes us especially unique, and thanks to Jessica's tremendous leadership, is that we are really very focused on culturally appropriate food, and especially with the work that we're doing and the research that we're going to be doing together, focusing on kosher and halal observant households, where we know that there are individuals who are not getting their dietary needs met simply because of their religious and cultural needs. And so our big focus is really treating our clients with dignity, which is why we're very invested in things like technology and especially a digital food pantry as well. And as the data that we saw recently from the New York Health Foundation shows, racial and ethnic and other groups are not equally satisfied with food and the food banks that pantries provide, which just underscores the need for this important work that we're discussing today.
Thanks so much, David. So it's now, you said you serve more than just the Jewish community, but a huge portion of the people that you serve are keeping kosher. And so it's now March, it's the beginning of Passover season. As I understand it, it's the beginning of, your busiest time of year. And can you tell us a little bit about what you expect the need will be this year and how that will compare to previous years? And I think, Jessica, you seem like the right person to put that question to.
Sure. Right. So Passover, and I will just also note that as our work has expanded to serve the Muslim community as well, we're approaching Ramadan. And really what this means is that it is an increased time of need for so many. To focus on Passover for a moment, as David was saying, our pantries serve people of all backgrounds, but when people come to the pantries that we operate and that we provide food to, they want to know that their unique needs are going to be met. And so while that is happening, regardless of the holiday season, in advance of Passover or in preparation of Passover, the foods that are required are going to be altogether different than the foods that are required throughout the rest of the year. There's actually a kosher certification for kosher for Passover food. And all of the foods that people would normally access in preparation for that time need to have that certification. And so it is, as you noted, Julia, a tremendous lift for our communities because we have to essentially, that's not product that would otherwise be donated, right? So many of our emergency food programs rely on programs like the USDA TFAP program, or for example, New York City has the CFC Community Food Connections program. Rarely, if ever, is kosher for Passover food going to be part of that donated food channel. And so we have to go out and really raise the dollars to be able to access that product, supply that product to a host of pantries. And on top of meeting just as you mentioned, I think we're serving 200,000 people a month right now through our pantry network. Passover presents, given the just the sheer expense of needing to replace food items that are kosher for Passover, everything down to the ketchup and the mayonnaise, places such an expense for people that some people who might not come to us the rest of the year or don't rely on the emergency food system the rest of the year do rely on us in advance of Passover. And so we could expect that we could serve anywhere from 300,000 to 400,000 people in advance of this holiday season, just because of the added pressure of preparing and needing to switch over everything in their homes, really to be accessible or acceptable for them to eat. On top of that, as I mentioned, we now have Ramadan, which this year coincides with Passover, which is a very unique occurrence. It doesn't always happen that way, given lunar schedules. But we are similarly investing in a whole suite of programs and services to make sure that those who would otherwise go to a pantry have the items that are appropriate for them so that they can celebrate and acknowledge and feed themselves and their families during this time.
Jessica, that's so interesting because I had anticipated, during a holiday season, there's often extra expenses. And so I thought, oh, there'll be more people coming, but I hadn't thought and this is, exposes my own ignorance about the issue, that I hadn't realized that just the kinds of foods will be so different. And so that places, I imagine, additional financial burden on both families and on providers like yourselves.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. It's sort of a double whammy, if you will, in that. And on top of that, of course, we have, as I'm sure so many providers on this call have experienced through their work and just personally at the grocery store, the impact of inflation continues to affect all of us. And while Met Council has really a tremendous record of working with our vendors to get the best prices, the reality is we've all seen the headlines around egg prices or avian flu consequences as it relates to poultry. These are things that impact our program and our clients directly. On top of that, and David may mention this later, but obviously the cuts to SNAP that people are going to be experiencing are impacting the bottom line for our clients as well. And the place that they come to is the food pantry and the lines that and the programs that we operate.
So actually, Dave, that's a question I'd love to get into. So, prices have risen. There's been a change in need. And I think that, with, the pandemic, food insecurity has just skyrocketed. And so many of you have had, like many providers have had to ramp up services. Can you give some specific examples of, how COVID-19 has changed your emergency food operations at Met Council.
Sure, absolutely. And I think there were sort of two perspectives on COVID. One is that folks sort of were frozen in place, and I think another was that people had to lean in. And from us as an organization that deals with the neediest in New York, we certainly decided that we were going to lean in a big way. We never actually closed our doors. We didn't actually work remotely. We got permission from the New York State Department of Health to come to work every day because we felt that the work was as important as other work that was happening, including other emergency workers. And I think what we saw in the beginning of the pandemic was very scary. It was only 3 or so years ago, but we forget what happened, which was that a lot of the food pantries in New York, that are many of which are volunteer driven, just simply shut down. They just couldn't operate anymore because of the logistical challenges, including the lack of knowledge, obviously, in terms of distance and how to distribute food and things like that. And so what we decided to do was really in the food world was two things. The first is we decided in the beginning of March that what we would do is that we would aggressively procure food because we believe that there would be essentially a shortage of commercially available food, and certainly food that wasn't available to individuals who were in need. And so we went out and we rented a second warehouse and we bought over $1 million worth of food. And we filled that second warehouse with food so that way to ensure that our pantry partners would never run out of food, which they never did. And I think that was significant in that we did that with the help of our core partners like UJA, the New York Community Trust, Mother Cabrini, to name a few. And then the second thing I think that was very important in terms of what we did was we decided to put on our advocacy hat. And we went to the city and state and started ringing the emergency bell and said, look, the entire food pantry network is going to shut down unless you infuse it with cash. Now, in retrospect, people eventually got there after a few months, but when we first came to the city and state in March, they thought we were crazy. Their view was, well, we have no money. What do you want us to do? And we said, look, you always have money. You're the government. You're the ones who need to partner with us. And so we started an advocacy effort with other folks in our space, and we went to the city and the state, and we convinced them to really start additional programming. So in the state, what that ended up being was that is the new program where you have money coming directly from farmers that is going to food pantries in New York. And that's been a very successful program in New York that has been enshrined into law and signed into law by Governor Kathy Hochul. And in the city, it essentially meant that the mayor started up a complete program with Catherine Garcia, who's now the state director of operations, where she moved from her role as sanitation commissioner to essentially being the emergency food czar. And she's wonderful. And we worked with her. And we ended up in a space where we grew by necessity, right? We weren't looking to grow, but people had the needs. And we were one of the few organizations that had the capacity and the planning to get it done. So we ended up being in a place where before the pandemic, we were giving out around 5 million pounds of food through 40 pantries and 129 special distributions. And post-pandemic, we're giving out 20 million pounds of food to 268 pantries. And that's actually how we ended up in the halal space, because when we looked at what was happening, we noticed that there were dozens of pantries that were halal that were not getting the service. And unfortunately, no one was looking out for them. And we thought the right thing to do was essentially to adopt those pantries. And we've done that. We've continued to do that to try to support our neighbors in need.
David, when you say that you noticed that, like, was this from networks that you're already involved in? Was this from ears to the ground of, people who are in your other pantries? Like, how did you find out about that need? Or do you have established relationships with the Muslim community already that sort of enabled that? I'd love to learn more about that.
Sure. So it's really all the above. We have done special distributions before that within the Muslim community, especially for holidays like Ramadan, where we provided some halal foods as it was needed. But we were also key partners in the Get Food NYC emergency food programming, and our work together with the mayor's office. We sat down with all of the major food distributors, the free food distributors in New York, including folks like Food Bank and City Harvest. And we tried to comb through and see, okay, where was the need? And what we realized was that while there was significant need, we weren't always able to match up the supply with that need. And so we started sorting and saying, okay, so naturally Brooklyn and Queens seems like a good fit for us. So we'll take the pantries in Brooklyn and Queens. But then it came to when we all noticed together, both anecdotally, and the fact that, remember, a lot of mutual aid societies that also popped up, a lot of pantries started overnight that didn't have access to things like EFAP or TFAP. And so we then realized that it was a necessity, and we said, okay, we'll do this because we have expertise in culturally appropriate food because of decades of work that we do in the kosher community. And that kosher expertise is so specific that we know the differences between literally every kind of kosher certification based on every community, exactly what they need and what they will and what they won't eat. And so we thought that was a natural partnership for us to be serving the halal community. And it's been a tremendous partnership, so much so that we actually hired a full-time halal food coordinator that does that work, that is currently working overtime before the Ramadan communities. So Jessica is doing twice as much work this year, but she's thrilled, I think, to be doing it, which is we're not only serving the kosher communities, we're also serving the halal communities, because this year, Ramadan and Passover and Easter all coincide at the same exact time.
Jessica, I want to ask you a question about that, specifically sort of meeting, the needs of religious observant communities. But I want to take a moment to just really nail down something David said. And that is that, philanthropy played a role in the beginning, it sounds like, in helping you get food so that you had a backstore, but that government is really playing an important role in this. And it sounds like both at the state and the city level, providing food, like providing money for food, but also, if I'm understanding you correctly, David, having that space to convene and bringing all the providers together was like another critical role that they played during that time, right? So there needs to be that partnership, right, between philanthropic, nonprofit, and government actors all sort of at the same time.
Absolutely. I will say that we're so grateful for the Mayor's Office for Food Policy playing that initial role in bringing, as David mentioned, City Harvest, Food Bank for New York City, Catholic Charities United Way, and Met Council to the table. And the work that we've been able to do to continue to partner has been so valuable and really so essential in raising up the profile, which is why I think so many people joined today's call, is that there's not a lot of recognition that there are these unique needs of religiously informed diets, and that a lot of our programs, both at the client level, but also at a policy level, and I know there was a question in the chat about our policy, at the policy level are not designed with these populations in mind. And I want to give special credit to New York City's, it was EFAP, it's now called CFC program, Community Food Connections, which has really made tremendous strides in their new contract to be able to provide an adequate amount of kosher and halal food, which is a direct driver in meeting the needs of those communities. Without the food, then we are reliant on philanthropy, which is variable and inconsistent and sometimes very generous, which is incredible, but is often not a consistent enough support to really provide lasting services in a community. And we've also been very grateful that, not just at the city level, but the state and even at the USDA level, we've really seen an interest in understanding how to partner so that we can better meet these needs, frankly, not just here in New York City and across New York State, but across the country.
And we couldn't agree with you more about both, the role of government and philanthropy there. But let's talk a little bit more about the challenges. What are specific instances to help people understand, that arise when trying to meet religious observant communities? And then to sort of your second point, like, how can policies help address these? Like, what kind of changes can we be making to get at, to make, there will always be challenges with emergency food distribution, but to reduce the challenges.
Sure. I'd say on the challenges, in working directly with communities, it always starts with trust and building that trust. And I think through the work over the last 50 years that Met Council has done has really been to build that trust with the Jewish community. We did not go into serving the Muslim community opportunistically. Rather, we said, this is a need. We're literally seeing these people, groups raising their hands and not having other providers who can meet that need. And we saw an opportunity to leverage the activism that we've brought to the Jewish community on behalf of another community. Building that trust is an everyday process with all of the groups we work with, Jewish and Muslim, and all of those who don't observe religiously informed diets, and is really something that we work really hard to do. We have a very lean team, a lean staff, and so it's just challenging to have the time to really build those relationships. But where we've found that it truly is a partnership where we work with communities, with community leaders, whether that's volunteers or imams or other community, David mentioned mutual aid societies, where we can really bring a partnership approach to meeting the needs in their communities. Another key piece of this, though, is having the appropriate product. And, as David said, we can track to know that this community takes this kind of certification and that community takes that kind of certification. But seeing is so often that product is not part of the donated food stream, which really makes up anywhere from 50 to 80% of a typical pantry's product line. Again, we are so reliant on philanthropy, which can be very variable and can be very challenging for us to provide consistent level of product and services to the pantries that we want to support and the communities we want to support. We do everything we can to offer that very consistent offering and to try to offer quality services that are replicable, et cetera. But until we make the policy changes that we need to ensure more reliably we get the product that we need, that will continue to be a challenge. And again, so grateful to our philanthropic funders who supply us with the resources to buy that product, frankly, so that we can, or access that product through donated sources so that we can supply these pantries.
Jessica, one thing you've shared with me before that I thought was so interesting was just the limited number of kosher and halal product, within TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I may be wrong here, but I believe when you started this work looking at the TFAP list, there was only one halal approved.
That's right. Actually, very unfortunately, there's still only one halal approved item on the TFAP list, which is tomato sauce. When we started this work, there were only 2 kosher certified products that were required to be kosher certified. Through the work we've been doing, and again, really,
and that's of thousands of products, right?
It's over. There are 155 products that are available through the TFAP program, okay, which they commit to purchase. And so only one of those is required to be halal certified. When we started this work, 2 were required to be kosher certified. We're now up to 8. And again, very grateful that USDA is in active communication with us about ways that we can, grow that number and enhance the role TFAP can play for communities in need. And, I think we may share this a bit later, but we've begun doing some national convenings ahead of the White House conference on hunger and nutrition that took place earlier this, I guess it was the summer of 2022. We began convening partners that were seeking to serve people who maintain religiously informed diets across the country. And time and again, we heard that there was not adequate product from TFAP, which often meant that many pantries simply weren't accessing the program at all, because they couldn't rely on it to meet the needs of their communities. And so the more information we can gather about what are the unique experiences of pantries and the groups that aim to serve them, about their unique needs, the resources they rely on, and where they fall short, the more we can bring that knowledge and that advocacy, those policy recommendations to the decision makers at the city, state, and federal level.
Jessica, could you talk a little bit more about some of the other work you did with USDA? Obviously, we're New York Health Foundation, we're focused in the state, but so much funding comes from the federal government. And so until there's changes there won't be changes at the state or the city level. And I think you mentioned this, but the work you're doing ahead of the White House conference was really helpful. And I'd also just love to hear, sometimes in New York, we think we're not doing enough. And then we look elsewhere and we're surprised that we're further ahead than other states. And I'm just wondering, how, is there work happening, like you mentioned, from partners elsewhere? How have you been able to come together and influence USDA? Because that's been, I know, a huge sort of shift in the administration, and one really exciting one recently.
Yeah, we are so grateful that they have brought a listening ear to this and a real interest in meeting and understanding this need with the hope of meeting it. It starts with education. We've had several calls with them just to understand, for them to better understand what does kosher and halal mean? What does it look like in different communities, and how can they work to better meet that need? I always say what's kosher to me may not be kosher to you. The same is true with halal, and the same is true outside of New York City, that there's a lot of variation. And we are doing our best to gather that information from across as many stakeholders as possible. And again, so grateful that USDA has been so willing and receptive to start with that education and to look at what are some of the levers that we can pull. Most notably, it is accessing more, working with producers and farmers to access more kosher and halal product. The good news is fresh product is always kosher, acceptable from a kosher and halal standpoint. And so, there's a lot of alignment with other groups that have also been advocating for more fresh product within TFAP and to move beyond just the shelf-stable canned items. And so that's an area where it benefits everybody. And the truth is, even with kosher and halal product, I'll say, everyone can eat kosher and halal product, certified product, and often do. You may be surprised that if you don't keep a kosher diet, look at your, soda soft drink or the canned item in your in your pantry, it probably has a kosher certification. You just don't realize it or value that. But for the communities that do value it, without it, they can't eat that item. And so getting USDA to really see that this is about building out access, and it's not just for the few who maintain these diets, but rather can benefit everybody. On that, I will say our data shows that 21% of all New Yorkers require kosher and halal food, which is surprising to many. For us, that was not so surprising, but is really a significant number. And so when we think about the programs, whether it's Nourish that David mentioned, or the work that, City Harvest, which is acknowledged in the comments here, they have a kosher program, or others. But really, we need to be thinking about a kosher and halal strategy that is a fifth of all of the work that we do if we are to meet the need here in New York City. And at this point, I think only Met Council is really devoting those kind of resources to it. But we look forward to partnering with all kinds of organizations so that we can leverage our resources and our influence and our networks to better meet and find this need.
And Jessica, you have great data, coming out of both the pandemic and from research you've done looking at what the need is, how many people you're serving, how many people you could be serving. But that's local to New York City. And now you're thinking about a project to expand to New York State. Can you talk a little bit more about, what that project will look like and why an assessment is needed?
Sure. Well, I have to start by saying thank you to the New York Health Foundation for seeing the value in this project. We could not do it without your funding and without your support, and without, frankly, convenings like this, because through this opportunity, we hope we'll connect with people across New York State who are interested in partnering with us to address the kosher and halal food need. But the only way to address the food need is start by measuring the food need and really trying to get a better handle on what is the kosher and halal food need across New York State, not just in our major metros, but really truly across the state, and are very excited to be able to embark on both a quantitative and qualitative process to evaluate the kosher and halal food need. We know that New York State has significant food insecurity, that it's not just here in the city. And we know anecdotally that many of the food banks are similarly constrained by the lack of kosher and halal product within the TFAP stream. And so many of those communities, we believe, and what we hear, are underserved as a result. And so really through this work, we're aiming to measure the kosher and halal food need, and then hopefully devise both policy as well as programmatic recommendations for how we can better meet that food need.
Yeah, I'm thinking just, New York Health has other program areas, and through our Special Projects Fund, we support work in several cities upstate looking at refugee resettlement. And one of the things we've heard from those groups actually is food insecurity needs and not being able to get enough halal product. And so, we're really excited about, building beyond anecdotal evidence, right?
Exactly.
And understanding that. I'm curious, as you think about equitable access to emergency food, what kind of policy recommendations, might this coalition support? Are there things that that are likely to come up already, or will it sort of just be responsive as you're meeting new partners?
I think it'll be a combination of both. We know and consistently see that many of the food programs are very prescriptive in the kinds of foods that are available for access. I mentioned New York City CFC doing a really great job in moving the needle of offering more kosher and halal product, but there is still a way to go on that. There really should be parity. If an item is available in a non-kosher format, it should be available in a kosher format. There's no reason that some people get fresh protein and some people don't. And so, I think we'll see a big push along those lines. I mentioned the fresh product. I don't know who doesn't appreciate fresh fruits and vegetables, and also with all of our desires to support people off, living more healthy lives, making nutritious decisions for themselves. I think that will be absolutely included, seeing as fresh produce is always kosher and halal and can benefit our upstate farmers as well. One thing that's not unique to the issue of kosher and halal, but I just want to be sure to mention, is that the USDA TFAP attestation process is very problematic and is only getting more so. It requires that all people accessing TFAP product attest to their income eligibility, and if pantries if a client does not do that, or a pantry participant does not do that, then they cannot access TFAP product, which puts tremendous burden on a pantry and is in direct conflict with New York City guidelines that suggest that no one should be turned away without food. And so, that is not related to the kosher and halal issue specifically, but given that many in these communities are immigrants new to this country, maybe figuring out their work status or not be on the books, may have different immigration status, this can be a very challenging burden that they are now confronting with, should they access the food, or do they want to answer this question, or can they answer it truthfully? And so we really would hope that we can move forward on this USDA TFAP attestation issue while addressing some of the more specific community-based issues like specific kosher and halal food.
Yeah, and I'll just say, because I'm sure you can't, I don't think anyone's coming to a food bank or a food pantry who doesn't need to be there. No one is, that's not how people want to spend their time, if they don't need to be. And so requiring people to then verify through a signature and, is an extra layer that seems pretty unnecessary.
And I'll just add, very burdensome for all of our food pantries. Most are running, as David said, exclusively on the backs of volunteers. They don't have the infrastructure or support, and TFAP doesn't offer any dollars, only access to food, which of course is a key element here, but presents an administrative burden that is very, very challenging.
Great.
I also want to just highlight, because I think it's an important point, is, I think it's actually very frustrating, and I think this is part of why this work that we're doing together and the research that we're doing is so important. I think in every aspect of life, we recognize people's individuality and we respect who they are and where they come from and their specific circumstances and backgrounds and their preferences. And it's honestly shocking when you think about it, that in the food space, we completely ignore that. And the policy has been for years, essentially in the United States, because you're poor, we don't care about you. So you should be grateful just to be getting food from us. And that's absurd and obnoxious. And quite frankly, right, if you look at the numbers, the Biden administration has been doing pushback on the Republicans. So they're advertising around how much does each individual taxpayer contribute to the federal budget. It's approximately $20,000 per person per year. For $20,000 per person per year, we can't come up with a system that respects people and their backgrounds. And if you're an immigrant or a migrant, or if you're Jewish or halal or Asian and you have food needs, we're not being respectful of that. That doesn't actually make any sense. And I, from our perspective, I think we find that fundamentally offensive. And that's why we're spending so much time and energy and resources really focused on this issue, because it's a basic issue of equity, right? This is not free product. It's paid for by the federal government or philanthropist or a combination of the two. And I think that's why we feel very passionately that this is really one of the last areas of this government-funded discrimination, right? You can't get the food that you want because we've decided that you're going to have a certain kind of food that you've never been used to or attuned to. And one of the biggest complaints that we hear from migrants is they're showing up and they're getting food and they're like, what is this food? We can't eat it. And for the same price, probably for cheaper, we could get them higher quality food that's more nutritious, that is culturally appropriate. I think that's really the depths of really what we're trying to mine for information. I think what we do at Met Council is we look at it holistically from a perspective of let's do the research, let's come up with the policies, and then let's do the advocacy work in that order. And the research phase, quite frankly, is most important. I think that the partners that we have on this call are going to be critical to really give us that information and the feedback so that we can do this work together, so we can have the appropriate research, so we can make the best possible arguments, so we can change the policies that, quite frankly, right now discriminate against a lot of Americans.
David, I think that's such an important point. I mean, you said it much better than I did, but the idea that we only get to have agency or identity when you're wealthy, and when you're poor, that's erased, or we don't count it. And I think, it should make us sick, right? Like thinking about that we're only willing to sort of acknowledge that when people have the money. One of the things, like this project will have great implications on cultural relevancy of food, like you said, beyond just kosher and halal. And I'm curious, what are other potential benefits you see coming out of this work? And I can think of a couple examples, but I'll only add them if at the end.
Sure. So, I think there are tremendous benefits, and I think that's why we're excited at the partnership with the New York Health Foundation to be doing this work, and why we're so committed to it on so many different fronts. I think the first thing that we actually discussed is that there is, whether it's willing or unwilling, there's certainly discrimination that happens against minorities in the United States, and especially against immigrants who are not having culturally appropriate resources. I'm sure it's beyond food, but I think food speaks to just one of those points. I think I mentioned before, I'm incredibly proud that we speak 15 different languages. That's by design, right? We want to make sure that everybody in New York who needs access to services has people they can speak to. That's the first thing, is language, but it goes a lot beyond that as well. I think that the research will help us really come up with recommendations as it relates to programs, legislation, funding as well, right? Jessica mentioned, for example, that in New York City, we now know for a fact, based on data, that 21% of New Yorkers in need would prefer kosher or halal food. And that's and that's a funding issue as well, right? Where it comes down to equity, which I think is important. And then I think, finally, I think that there are a lot of barriers to emergency food access. And once again, I really want people who are on this call to think about it, regardless of your background, right? We take it for granted. No matter how much money we have in our pockets, we get to choose the products that we want, right? We go into a store, and if you have $50 or $100, you get to pick what you want. The idea that we are essentially forcing people to take food that they don't want is really one of the last vestiges of institutionalized discrimination that we have because of poverty that we see. And we think it's important that we need to speak up. And I think that the biggest benefit is the coalition building, right? We have on this call well over 100 people from all sorts of different backgrounds, with all different information, who have different experiences. And by allowing us now to work together and to really do the engagement and the listening and the partnership, I think that we're going to learn a lot beyond just the kosher and halal world, but other issues and ethnicities and backgrounds and other barriers that we think people who are in need are facing. And I think that a lot of that information will come out. But more importantly, the partnerships, I think, are permanent, right? To have an excuse to speak to people and convene people from New York City and Buffalo and Syracuse and all parts of the state and say, okay, let's talk about similar issues, I think is important. And we saw that when we did the convening with Representative Jim McGovern that Jessica and I hosted in New York City. We brought together other groups, and it was eye-opening, not just for us, but for Congressmember McGovern. And we did that to push the federal government to have the first conference, national conference on poverty and hunger in 50 years. And these things matter. Representation matters. And the reality is that we view a large part of what we do beyond service. And I think what's unique about the work that we do at Met Council is we have a tremendous research and policy team where we're advocates on behalf of those who, quite frankly, don't have a voice and literally, in many cases, don't speak the language. And I think that's incumbent upon all of us, and those of us who have the privilege, quite frankly, of having full refrigerators, which I think is a tremendous privilege, right? We take it for granted that we can open up our fridge and there's always something to eat. We need to spend our time advocating on those people who don't have that privilege and to really ensure that they have what they need. And when we're spending $20,000 per American on taxpayer dollars, there should be enough resources to make sure that every person has the ability to eat healthy and nutritious food. That's a basic right. I fundamentally believe that. And they should have culturally appropriate food that they want to eat, and that should be nutritious. And I think that's what's going to come out of this research, which will lead to a lot of tremendous benefits down the road.
Yeah, I'll say that, I mean, I think conversations like the ones that Met Council is having with USDA have really opened the door to expanding sort of cultural relevancy writ large within food programs. I mean, one example that just comes to mind is the special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children. So WIC, you know, there was just a recently proposed rule that just closed this last week with USDA, and many of the foods that they're considering adding to the WIC package are foods that they know that, you know, immigrant populations want access to. And I think that the conversations sort of like this and like the ones that you've been having across the city, across the state, and across the federal government are really important to even getting, you know, government to consider those changes.
I will just say, Julia, that we mentioned briefly, because I think it's an important point, the role of philanthropy. The reality is that nothing would happen without philanthropy. And I really want to stress that, because I think it's an important role, right? Which is that government really comes to us. We are the experts, and they come to us and they literally ask us, what should we do? And based on the philanthropic dollars and the research and the recommendations and the policies, we have then the ability to say, okay, here's what a best-in-class system looks like. So the role of philanthropy is not just needed, it is critical. Without philanthropy, none of this is happening in any efficient or practical or pragmatic way, and we're really not moving the needle in any significant way. And so very appreciative for your investment and for the investment of everyone in the philanthropic world who appreciates and understands that if you want to move the literally multi-billion-dollar levels of government, you need philanthropic dollars in order to do this kind of work, because government is not investing in this kind of work.
Okay, well, I'm looking at the chat now and I see we have a ton of questions. So I want to, you know, make sure we use the last 10 to 15 minutes to get to those. I'm going to summarize a few of them. One question that has come up, and Jessica, maybe I'll put this to you, is if people are interested in getting involved in your research and they're outside New York City, what's the best way to do that? How can they be involved?
Yeah, we hope you will. So even if you didn't put it in the chat, we hope you'll follow up with us. You can reach us at policy@metcouncil.org. And I know there'll be an email following this webinar. Hopefully we can include that there as well. This work of assessing and really building a coalition of stakeholders across New York State will be happening shortly. We're just in the hiring phase now, and we'll be reaching out. So if you know groups, know people who might be interested in this work, please just shoot us a note and someone will follow up with you. That is the best way to reach us, and we hope you will be in touch.
Great, and I'll just, you know, you can see the chat as well, but just remind you that there are people from, you know, Cornell Cooperative Extension, from the New York State Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, from Feed More Western New York. Those are some of the groups that have said they're interested. So want to just highlight that. Another more specific question, can you please clarify when you say 20% of New Yorkers would like kosher or keep kosher, is that for local to New York City, or is that statewide?
Sure. So I think it was dropped in the chat, but or if you visit our website at metcouncil.org, you can see our study, which David also referred to, the Get Food report. For those who may remember those early days of the pandemic when the city truly shut down and senior centers were initially closed, there was a serious concern about how we would get food to people who could not go out for whatever reason, whether they were quarantined or they were experiencing their own, you know, other kinds of illness or didn't have access to help and other sources of support that they previously had. The city launched the Get Food program, which allowed New Yorkers to call 311, New York City residents to call 311 and request a delivery of food. And there were a variety of options that were available that people could express that didn't start with the initial launch of the program, but quickly was folded in. And through that, we had, for the first time ever, access to data specifically about the demand for kosher and halal food. So often we reflect on need using the only metric we have, which is really supply. How many people were on the line? How many people did we serve is often a function of how much food did we have to give out, not about how many people would want to come to us or came to us and were turned away. That we have this record that the city was generous to share with us from the Get Food data allows us to see exactly how many people and from where requested a variety of food choices. And for our purposes, we focused on kosher and halal. And so it's nearly 21% of people who called during that period. And you can slice and dice the data a bunch of different ways. You can drill into your council districts, your congressional district, and really see that information. It's a tremendous tool. We believe, I will say it's interesting. There are certain communities, and you asked Julia earlier about some of the challenges we face. I think this data is actually a really good reflection of some of those challenges. As an example, many of the communities that we know need kosher food and experience high rates of poverty, for example, Williamsburg, with a high need for kosher food, under participated in the Get Food program. So when you look at the data, there is not as much of a prevalence as we frankly know there to be, but it's because they didn't trust that in calling 311, their unique needs would be met. And so as we do this work, we really have to layer that on, which is what also is missing from the story that we're telling, what is missing from the data. I also implore all of you, if you're thinking about, do you have a kosher and halal food need? It's not simply by looking at your line. If people, or the people you serve, I should say, the clients that you're engaging with, oftentimes there may be a need right around you, but if people don't feel that their needs will be met by your services, they're not even showing up. And so, as we think about doing this work, we really need to take a person-centered approach and really do a grassroots approach, and not just rely on informants, even like Met Council, to say what is the need, because there could be people to the right or left of us who are left out from it. But I do encourage everyone to look at that study. We're very proud of it. I want to give credit to my colleague DJ, who really worked so hard to make that report come to life and really tells an important story about the need of New York City residents.
And we do have some people joining from outside the state, and I will say, if I'm remembering correctly, Jessica, you also have data because you put in 2 questions to a nationwide Muslim American community survey, right? That talks about halal need and kosher need nationwide. So it looks a little bit different than what the city need is, right?
That's right. So we're really excited about this study. We'll be releasing it very, very shortly. It was in partnership with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and it's part of their 2022 American Muslim poll. We actually paid to have 2 questions inserted. I want to thank New York Community Trust, for their support, which allowed us to do that. Which is a nationwide study, as you mentioned, that looks at the behaviors and practices within the Muslim community and allowed us to really begin to ascertain the degree of food insecurity within this community and the request for or the desire to maintain a halal diet. So that information will be out shortly and is really part of our effort to gain data and to gain information wherever we can to really create a better shared understanding of the experience of those who maintain religiously informed diets as it relates to food insecurity across the country. Because as David mentioned, we need to be able to educate the federal government and all of our government partners so that we can have policies that truly reflect the diversity of the country.
Okay, and I have another question here. Has there been any effort to get the federal reimbursement rates or new funding streams to provide funding to communities that have religious dietary accommodation needs? This is Stephen O'Brien, actually from the Department of Ed, is saying that there are additional costs associated with offering kosher and halal meals. And I assume Stephen knows that from doing it within the school district, because that's something that New York City DOE is now doing. Do you have a solution to that? Or is that happening in the emergency food system?
I think we do have a solution to it. And I think there's 2 things to note here. So the first is that while it is true that when it comes to prepared food, it is actually more expensive, and a lot of that has to do with certification cost. When it comes to pantry food, most of the food is actually not more expensive. And so I think that's a very important point, right? So a kosher and halal can of tuna, the same exact price as a non-kosher or non-halal can of tuna. And the reason I mention that, because I think that it sort of speaks to sort of like this myth that says, oh, if we want to give out kosher food, it's going to be more expensive. 80% of the kosher or halal products that you want to give out cost exactly the same. And while it is true that when it comes to preparing the food, there are higher expenses. And when it comes to things like meat and chicken, it is more expensive, but that's the 20%. So I just say that because I think it's important, especially pantries out there across the state or the country are saying, hey, I want to do this. There are things that you can do very quickly to provide a lot more kosher and halal food immediately to individuals who are in need. But the second point I think is very important, and I think it speaks to sort of the broader philosophy that we have here at Met Council. We decided a couple of years ago that this is going to be our top priority, and we're going to make a major investment in this. And we are spending literally millions of dollars and thousands of hours from the research to the policy. And we hired federal lobbyists, we have city lobbyists, state lobbyists, we have internal lobbyists, external lobbyists, we have communications teams. We are 100% committed to this. And the work that we're doing now has gone federal as well. We actually recently had a conversation with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand about this because, as you know, she serves on the Agriculture Committee, and that is the committee that oversees the Farm Bill, and the Farm Bill is going to be reauthorized soon. And one of our big asks of the federal government is, in fact, to provide funding for this and to also provide funding for staff who can focus on this issue as well as it relates to kosher, halal, and culturally appropriate food. So the short answer is yes, and we are 100% committed to it, and we're going to put the time and the resources and the effort necessary because, like I said, we believe this to be a matter of discrimination. It's not simply a question of, are you getting the food that you need? As Jessica pointed out, the fact that you don't have Muslims showing up at your food pantry doesn't mean they don't need it. It means that they see a sign that says, no Muslims are welcome here. That's the problem, right? And so that has to change. And the only way that changes is if we actually change the system so that it is open and accessible to all, so that the system that we're all used to, which is you walk into a grocery store and choose the product that is best for you, that system is the same system that we have in our food pantries. And that only happens with government cooperation and willingness. They still provide the overwhelming majority of funding for food pantries across the country, especially through their supply of food. And that's something that we're going to continue to advocate on. And that's a mission that we're absolutely committed to.
Thank you, David. We're just about to round out time, so I just, there's a ton of questions in the chat still. We won't have time to get to them all, but I think that, both the number of people who showed up today on this webinar, the number of questions really speaks to the importance of this issue and the urgency. And so want to thank you both. I'll just pause for a minute and say, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we sort of wrap it up?
I'll leave Jessica with the last word. I just want to add that you can email us policy@metcouncil.org, policy@metcouncil.org. That's seen by our entire policy team. If you want to participate, if you have questions, if you have ideas, that's the way to get in touch with us. I think that's important. And I think the second thing I want to say is that, there's only room for a few squares on the Zoom, but the work that is happening with everyone on this call. We can't do it alone. We know that. We've taken this responsibility and this role and this advocacy seriously, and we're happy to lead it. But quite frankly, we're not going to be successful unless we're working in partnership with everyone else who's on this call and everybody who is involved. And we not only welcome your participation, we're asking you for your partnership and participation because we know the only way we can do this is by organizing together. So thank you to everyone on this call, and we will look through the list of comments after this webinar, and we will try to reply to everyone. But if you didn't get your answer, just email us, policy@metcouncil.org, and we'll get right back to you. Thanks so much.
Jessica, any last words or?
I would just, everything David said, there's a tremendous team behind us that are helping make this work possible. And of course, all of our philanthropic government partners as well. I will say, as we are approaching the holiday season of Ramadan and Passover, for those who are joining and you may not be familiar with those holidays and the customs that are involved, I encourage you to read about it, read more, learn about it, reach out if you have questions, particularly if you're in a place to think about how your services can be more welcoming to people who are preparing for those holidays.
Well, big round of applause. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, Jessica. The work you're doing at Met Council and the work that hopefully you'll be doing with everyone else on this call is so important. And just as a reminder to everyone, if you have more questions, we'll be recording this webinar is being recorded, and we'll share the link and other materials tomorrow. If you have colleagues who weren't able to join, you can direct them there. And thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.